Hi guys, welcome to part 6 of creating an anime environment in Blender. Today we're going to be going over shading and lighting, which is the biggest part of an anime environment. So let's hop right in. We're going to start with a diffuse shader into a shader to RGB and a color ramp, and we're going to plug that into an emission, or you can plug it right into the output. Doesn't really matter either way. But the black is going to be your shadow and the white is going to be your like midtones. All right, you can do a 3-tone one where you have shadow, midtone, and highlight, but in this situation we're not using that. It's just a simple background environment and it does not need a 3-tone shader at all. So you could bring in your light. I usually use like a lamp, or what is this called, like an area lamp. I don't particularly use a sun lamp because it casts over everything in an environment and it creates accurate shadows, accurate lighting, and it's a pain when you're working with this style. So you can see here I'm tweaking the area light so that I can get the shadows where I want them to be, and then I just select the same color that I have the canvas texture as, and then I just tone down the value of that, make it darker. Then you get this a very simple shadow, and you do this for everything. Like all of my textures, all of my shadows, shading for pretty much everything, my anime environments is this incredibly simple, 4-node texture setup for shading. And the biggest part is your lamp setup. Where is your lighting and how are you going to trick the lighting? When I say trick, we're going to go into that later on in this video. That's why this is going to be an 18-20 minute video or something like that. It is incredibly important that your lighting is not realistic. That is the biggest flaw, the biggest mistake people make, I believe, when it comes to making anime, NPR, stylized, whatever you want to call it, kind of 3D art. It doesn't look flat because you're casting real, correct lighting. Now, you might not think you realize this, but your eyes and your brain absolutely do. You see correct lighting all day, every day in your life. And if you're watching anime, you see and your brain acknowledges the fact that that is not correct lighting. The lighting is fake, it's not casted correctly. Like, for example, if a light shines through a window, it'll flare out the further away it gets from the window. It'll get wider. In anime, that doesn't always happen. It usually just stays square, perfectly square, and it's visually appealing, but that is not accurate in 3D space. So it's super easy for people to just throw in a sun or a couple lamps and say, it looks all right, but something feels off. Something always feels off if you mess up this step. And like, here's a little trick. If you have shadows in places you don't want shadows, you can bring in an area light, scale it down, lower the strength of it or the watts, and you can put it extremely close to the mesh. And what this can do is it can cover up your shadows. Another thing you can do is you can just select that part of the mesh and assign an emission shader that is just the color of the canvas or the wood or whatever texture you're using. The thing is, you can't have realistic lighting. So use whatever tricks you need to use to trick that. There's 3 methods that I will typically use. 1, I will use the area lights and I will put them in positions to make sure that the lights and the shadows are in the places that I want them to be. 2, I will assign an emission shader without the diffuse to shader to RGB to color ramp. This way I get a flat color that goes straight to where I want it. Another thing I'll do, like you can see here, this is the example. I want shadows here. I want shadows to the left of this windowsill. So I add a loop cut and I assign an emission shader with the shadow texture for the canvas. Now, you don't have to have this dynamic changing light. I know for the 3D community and stylized, I'm part of the BNPR Discord community. Everyone's so obsessed with lighting. So like, as the lighting changes, how do the shadows change? I get it, but I want you guys to watch some of your favorite animes and really watch how often does the shadows really change in these backgrounds, especially these backgrounds. The characters, yes, a lot of times characters this happens, but your backgrounds, your shadows will stay the same. And I've even tested this. You can keep the shadows that you have in daytime, make it nighttime, like make it bluish, dark, and put a nighttime background in, and leave the shadows like they were for daytime, and it still works just fine. So this is, you know, it's a trickery in your brain. We see constant correct lighting, but we know that anime has false, fake lighting. And so when we're doing this in 3D, basically we want to do the opposite effect of 3D. So that's what we're doing in this house. I'm also doing a little bit of color correction. I want these blinds, these wooden blinds, to be darker so that we have a little bit more contrast, a little bit more color in our house. But you want to make sure that these lights are not correct, that they're just visually appealing lights. And this can be done in a few ways. Look at references, look at a lot of references. I mean, when you really start getting into this, when you watch anime, it's hard to not realize how little work goes into the changes of lighting and shadows in environments. Like the shadows stay constant and they very little change. The lighting changes, the color changes, but the shadows don't. Also, like the freestyle lines have a huge effect on the 2D aspect of it, creating this flatness. So some styles of anime have very, very little to no line outlines, and some have very thick, like Demon Slayer. Demon Slayer has like these super thick outlines for their characters and even backgrounds. And then some animes, I can't think of any off my head, but have these very thin or almost invisible lines. But for 3D, the best experience I've had is you have these flat colors, fake lighting, and lines. You got to have some kind of outline to create this drawn or painted kind of look. I think mine look more drawn than painted because the colors are so flat. But you guys get the idea. You keep your colors flat, get your shadows fake, and really just keep it simple. Get your colors correct. That's what I'm doing. I'm spending a little bit more time making sure my colors look good. Nothing we can't fix in the compositing stage, which will be in the next video. And I won't be doing the compositing for this house particular, because when you're compositing for one house, it's not complicated. So I'm going to show you guys what I did for the composition of the entire environment of the animation. This way you can see the entire breakdown of how much work goes into that, because for one house compared to like 20 houses, compositing changes very differently from those two times. So, you know, in the shading and coloring stage of all of this, make sure your shape is right. So like in the roof, make sure your tiles aren't lapping this this area where it cuts off. You know, get that right, get your colors correct, make sure that your shadows are faked or in the right places. Please guys, look at references, or I'll show you guys what I do. I personally render out a flat with just like a sun lamp, right? And you get these flat shadows that are in the right places, and then I'll mark out where shadows need to be. This way you have a better idea of where things need to be. I constantly do these quick renders because, like I said, obviously you see in the viewport. The viewport and the render looks vastly different because of the freestyle lines. And for me, I like to have this visual verification of what it looks like. So here you can see on the left, I have real shadows, like from sun lamps, and on the right, I have fake lighting, which is what I did custom. So I'm going to show you the process I go into. So I'm going to, select this, and I'm going to take a grease pencil, and I'm going to mark out where I want shadows to be. That they're not being casted. The shadows aren't being casted in these areas, and they probably should be. So we're gonna start in some simple areas, some obvious spots. So like one is this canvas here on the right. There's this part where there's light, and I just want the whole thing in a shadow, because we it doesn't need to be in the light. It's too much detail that doesn't need to be there. And then you start getting into places like here. Underneath this stick out part, it should definitely be darker. I know it's already dark, but it could definitely be darker. In anime, you can have shadows on shadows, to say something like that. And then on the left side of this house, it's more of an alleyway, so I want a shadow there. This barrel could maybe use a highlight here where the sun hits it a little bit more, so it's got a little more variation. This side of the house. So you get the idea of, we want to create more shadows, but they're not typically where they would be if you were to just throw a sunlight in, or even if you're moving lamps all over the place. It's still really hard to do this without those tricks of emission shaders. And sometimes what I'll do is I have like a mix shader with an overlay, set to overlay, and a color ramp that controls that. And if you have it to black, it's shadow. If you have it to white, it's like midtone. And if I want it to be shadow, I'll get rid of the white and create it as its own texture. And then you just have that one part as a shadow because it's overlapped by black. So like here on the roof, it could use a little bit of extra shadows because it just looks bland. But there's a lot with this scene. It looks good. Like if you were to look at this, you'd say, well, this is a good environment. Why are you doing anything to change it? But especially when you're working on it, you're looking at it over and over again. You're like, there's something not right about this. Something that just doesn't sit right. And 9 times out of 10, if your geometry is good, your outlines are good, and your colors are good, it's your lighting. It's like, actually, scratch that. 9 times out of the 10, if you're not satisfied with your render, it's probably lighting if you're trying to do anime style. It's so subconscious that it's insane. It's literally insane how much your mind is already used to what it relates these it has visual cues. So I read like a study once on, perceiving depth. One thing we do to perceive depth is shadows, colors, lighting, size, how things overlap, all kinds of things like this. And these are things that 2D artists have to think about. So like you can see here, I mark out all my shadows where I want them to be. Now, if you're drawing, you would just draw your shadows. But in 3D, we can get automatic shadows pretty easily. But the thing is we're trying to do the reverse effect. We're trying to take 3D and kind of degrade the effect that it has. We don't want it to look 3D, we want it to look 2D. So therefore, we need to stop thinking like 3D artists and start thinking like 2D artists. Draw your outline. Color flat before you get into your shading. And when you get into your shading, you're not just putting a sun lamp in and saying, it's good. No, you're putting in your fake light. You need to put in fake shadows, because if you're drawing in your shadows, and they're not going to be physically correct every single time. So you really need to focus on this aspect and get used to it. When you're watching anime, when you're watching these, it's really just only anime, focus on it. Like you can see here in the final, it looks so much better. It's brightened up, the shadows are in the right places, there's more shadows, just everything looks better. Especially when you watch the animation, you're like, wow, there's such a big difference, and you almost can't tell why. And like I'm circling here, kind of like those books, what's the difference? Can you tell the difference? Well, it's these shadows. It's crazy how your mind works. And I'm probably just weird because I studied this and I wanted to know, but it was like, my first thought when creating this style in 3D was like, how do 2D artists do it? How do they draw? So if they draw like this, how am I going to do it in 3D? And the thing is, like, you had to reverse engineer what 3D is doing. 3D has correct lighting. Well, I don't want correct lighting. 3D has correct shading. Well, I don't want correct shading. So you're ending up working backwards in 3D. But the benefit of this is you don't have to draw every frame, thank God. You know, because 30 seconds at 12 FPS, I mean, I don't want to draw that many frames. So you get the benefit of you can model these things out. So like this took me 4 days and I got a 30 second animation. Now, if I was drawing it, that'd probably be a different story. So that's the benefit of doing these things in 3D. So understanding how 2D artists think when they're drawing. 2D artists have to think, how can I give the perception of depth? But 3D artists have to think, how can I deceive, like, how can I not give the perception of depth the same way? Like, so 2D artists, the way you can look at a drawing and see that it has depth is much different than how you can see depth in 3D viewports or renders. Like, have you ever thought, how can I look at a drawing and know that it's 2D? And how can I look at a picture and say that I know this is 3D even though it's a 2D picture? The difference is the lighting, the shadows, and so forth. When you're drawing, a lot of things aren't going to be realistic. You can't replicate real life, you know, to a T every single time. And some people do really well with it. But in anime, that's not the goal. It's stylized. It's not meant to look like real life. So when we're working in 3D, we're working in a workspace that is meant to create real looking, real life, photoreal things. I mean, you look at Marvel's animations, their movies, incredible. Their VFX, they have a sense of realism, and 3D software is amazing for that. I don't think it was ever really made to create anime or stylized kind of work. So we have to work backwards. We have to think differently. We have to think like we're drawing. We have to, you know, do things differently than we're taught to do. And to do that, it's actually really simple, and it surprises me that not many people know this. Flat textures, outlines, basic geometry, and fake shadows. If I had to put my top 4 things on how to do it, that would be my top 4 things. So you can see here, I have my light, and I have these flags. I learned this, I was watching a video on cinematography, and when they're doing shots in movies, sometimes they will have like light cards or flags that block out light in certain areas. So I used it in 3D viewport because I was like, I don't want shadows everywhere. So I use these very, very often. Especially you want to make sure they're outside of your camera view though, because if you're using freestyle lines, it creates a whole slew of problems. But having these light cards, it really helps trick lighting more. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys next time in the next part of this series.